Wait a minute. You? I saw a familiar-looking gorgeous doctor calling out to me, but now was no time for small talk. First is the pregnant woman. She turned to leave, her face displaying regret at what I had said. Things suddenly changed the following day. Our mystery-solving adventure, which began with a small wager more than 20 years ago, linked to someone's unbelievable ideas. Okay, let's settle this. My name is Richard, and I'm just an average 38-year-old man. I refer to myself as ordinary because I think I'm just a regular person leading an ordinary life. There's nothing exceptional about me. I am that. At the age of 18, I traveled overseas on my own. I questioned whether leading a typical life, completing high school, attending college, and landing a job, would actually bring me true happiness. My academic performance was lacking. Nonetheless, I was fluent in both Japanese and English because my mother was Japanese and my father was a former military officer. However, because native English and the English taught in Japan differ greatly, my test results were merely mediocre, giving the impression that I am only passably proficient in the language depending on the circumstance. Mother had black hair and black eyes, and father was blonde with blue eyes. I therefore have dominating black hair and black eyes from birth. Although I go by Richard, a normal Japanese person, most people are surprised to learn that I am half Japanese. I told my parents that I was leaving Japan without taking the university admission examinations since I had an ambition of visiting the outside world. I was prepared with a number of reasons in case they rejected the notion, but they waved me off without saying anything. I left for overseas as soon as I graduated from high school, and it has been 20 years since then. I'm 38 years old, unmarried, and haven't even started seeking for a girlfriend. Maybe I couldn't make one, though. I can't get rid of the image of the girl I grew up with. It resembles a curse. Work had prevented me from going home, but now that things have calmed down, I made the decision to visit my family's house in a small Japanese town. I wanted to surprise my parents, so I hadn't told them about the trip. I got on the plane, heart thumping. After 20 years, a lot had changed in the hometown I went back to. I used to take the train from the nearby town to the high school and the closest station, which I used every day for those 3 years, didn't look anything like I remembered. The famed donut shop has taken the place of the stand-up soba business under the gloomy lights. Beside it stood a pair of fast food outlets crowded with middle-class and high school kids dressed casually. There were no such locations when I was a student, and we would converse on the couches in a little retail center instead. Over time, a lot has changed. A short distance away were a convenience store, a souvenir shop, and a hip cafe where students studied and socialized. I felt as though I had strayed into another reality. This was not the hometown I knew anymore. My bag and I were heading towards the taxi stand when we noticed a big, unfamiliar edifice. Simultaneously, the taxi driver I had reserved emerged, placed my bags inside the trunk, and struck up a conversation with me. "Hi there. Are you spending time with relatives?" "Yes, indeed. I haven't been here in almost 20 years." Then you have to be shocked at how far this community has come. This is the town's first high-rise, a condo. It was quickly completely booked. It appears that the same company is already getting requests about erecting comparable high-rises somewhere else. In addition, cram schools and tutoring facilities are located above the first floor, which also has a 24-hour gym and cafe. Instead of being housed in a dilapidated old building, the cram school I went to in middle school is now one of these high-rises. I noticed additional buildings that didn't look like they belonged in this small town while I was driving in the taxi and peered out the window. I went by the elementary and middle schools I used to attend. The once ratty buildings had been totally restored and were now immaculate, with no remnants of their former existence. It seemed a little depressing, despite the fact that the town's expansion and development were positive indicators. By automobile, it would take me around 30 minutes to go to my folks' place. I asked the driver to take a detour because it was lunchtime and the main highways were congested. I saw a woman peering out the window while I was waiting at a red light. She was obviously in an emergency scenario because she was squatting and looked like she was in pain. "Excuse me, that woman over there. She looks unwell." The cabbie saw it too and pulled over right away. I hurriedly exited the cab to assist the woman. The pregnancy mark was visible on her bag. It was obvious that a pregnant woman in distress was a severe issue, and my first impulse was to dial 911. That could take some time, given the amount of traffic on the main road. "How are you doing? Where is your physician located?" The woman was asked by the taxi driver who had also exited the vehicle. "Her clinic was right ahead," she said in a low voice. Then it would be quicker to get her into a taxi than to wait for an ambulance. We made the hasty decision to send her the 500 meters to the obstetrician. Fortunately, the taxi had supplies and clean towels for a maternity trip, even though the woman was already in labor. While I called the hospital, we handled the problem. They claimed they would get ready for delivery, and I did as they instructed. The woman was carried to the delivery room on a stretcher as soon as we got there. A stunning doctor who appeared to be in charge looked at me at that same moment and exclaimed, "Wait a minute, are you?" I ignored her, giving her a perplexed look, and added, "Just take care of the mother and baby." The female doctor then abruptly realized what had happened and apologized, saying, "I'm sorry," before vanishing inside the delivery room. Like the last time, the baby cried for the first time within 15 minutes, and both the taxi driver and I exhaled with relief. The pregnant woman was a stranger to me. I made the decision to go since I could not stay there any longer. After a mere few minutes, I reached my folks' residence. I was surprised by how little the cab fare was when I went to pay it. I questioned the driver why curious. He said, "I stopped the meter while we helped the pregnant woman, so you don't need to pay for that part." After giving it some thought, I said, "All right," and gave him a $100 bill. Consider it a tip for guiding me around the city and for quickly helping the pregnant woman. I responded to him when he tried to give me change. He continued to bow his head in appreciation as I got out of the taxi. I made sure the cab had departed before I pressed my home's doorbell. My mother emerged a moment later, older but not any less like her youthful self. Her eyes widened briefly as she froze, but then she smiled cheerfully and greeted me. "You've gotten so big. You came out of nowhere and astonished me. Enter now." My father was viewing something on his smartphone in the living room. My mother approached me and whispered in my ear, "Your father has been hooked on this masked band," curious as to what had drawn his interest to such an extent. "He's American, after all, and he adores stuff like this. When are they coming to Japan?" is something he says nonstop. This being said, I returned my focus to my father. He began speaking without even saying hello to me. I sensed the spirit in these four musicians' music, the drummers who keep everything together, the bassist who masters the deep tones, the guitarist who genuinely likes the song, and the vocalist whose soul shines through even on television. They are awesome and wonderful in every way. I spent some time talking with my folks before returning to my room. It seemed as if the room I had occupied from my early years through high school had been preserved in time. Not a single particle of dust fell off the desk or window when I ran my finger over them. It made me feel warm to think about how my mother must have handled this space. We shared a family meal together later, and I had a lengthy soak in the bathtub. After spending so much time overseas, it was comforting to rediscover the distinctive Japanese habit of taking a hot bath. I woke up the following morning to the sound of my parents fighting with someone after sleeping in a cozy bed. Thinking it would be improper to walk out like that, I changed out of my sweatsuit quickly and headed downstairs. My parents were fighting with an unknown middle-aged man at the door. His eyes went wide with rage when he saw me, and he said, "Is that you, you scoundrel? You fooling my daughter, how dare you? I will not pardon you. You're going to own up to this." Please settle down. It's unbelievable that our son would act in this manner. In addition, he was only back 2 days ago. My mother attempted to reason with the man, but he was too angry to listen. To be honest, I had no idea what he was about. I deduced from his remarks that he believed I had gotten into some sort of problem with a woman. But I hadn't been talking to any women. My mother was the only female contact on my personal phone. As I wondered what this could be about, I discovered that the man was the father of the woman I had brought to the hospital yesterday because she was pregnant. Somehow, he had come here in a rage, thinking that I was the ex-boyfriend of his daughter. Given that I had only returned to Japan yesterday, it was understandable that my mother would deny it without needing to speak with me. Although I don't believe the hospital would have disclosed my information in violation of confidentiality, I do remember one thing. She insisted on expressing her gratitude to me and requesting my contact details yesterday when I brought her to the hospital. No, I didn't accomplish anything that merits appreciation. It's morally decent to assist those in need, I had informed her. I could not dispute further when she insisted, even though I declined, so I just told her that I lived close. I didn't believe that would be enough to identify me, but it seems the father had heard hospital personnel discussing me. To be honest, the man who brought Emily here walked away silently. Is he the father of the child? Emily is single, correct? Yes, I did hear that. During therapy, the midwife made an effort to inquire, but she remained silent. However, the hospital is powerless to step in as it is her choice. After taking her to the hospital, her father seems to have come to the conclusion that her former partner had abandoned her after she became pregnant, only to reemerge and then vanish again. Though I doubt most people would draw such assumptions, he must have become extremely anxious upon discovering he was suddenly the grandfather of a grandson. I would probably go crazy too if my daughter announced all of a sudden that she had a baby and that there is no father. He asked his daughter, of course, but she gave him no answers. In an attempt to elicit information from his daughter, he remarked casually, "It seems a kind person brought you here," realizing that asking more questions would not provide any answers. She mentioned that I lived nearby and that I might be mixed race while laughing and talking about me. That description led him to infer that it was us. My mother loved to talk, and my father was a former military man, so our family stood out, which is why he stormed in today. My mother was thinking about calling the cops since this miscommunication was getting out of control. I clarified that yesterday was our first meeting and that I didn't know the woman. I just returned from overseas yesterday, so I really don't care to hear justifications. My dear daughter Emily, how did it get to be like this? Emily seems to be the daughter's name. Her father's rage didn't go away, and our debate just got hotter and hotter. We are unable to handle this on our own. After giving birth, Emily is still in the hospital, so we shouldn't be bothering her right now. Perhaps we ought to speak with the police, I proposed. A third person interrupted at that point, saying, "This man is not your daughter's ex-boyfriend." Everyone looked at the individual who was behind Emily's father. The stunning obstetrician was the one who desired to communicate with me. He genuinely just happened to aid Emily yesterday when she went into labor on the street and got her a taxi to the hospital. Your daughter will undoubtedly become unhappy if she discovers this misunderstanding. I can see why you're worried, but just relax. But I can personally attest to Dr. Smith. He's not a nasty guy. Emily's father did not appear persuaded, despite her assurances. But he was unable to refute the doctor's advice for his daughter, so he ended up glaring at me. My father, who is normally quiet, then broke into a speech. My kid was not brought up to treat another person's daughter badly. My son is not that kind of man, I swear to God, and if he were, I would set him right. Despite being in his late 60s, my father's presence was commanding because of his military experience. Even I, his son, gasped for air and could not speak. At last, Emily's father realized what was going on and expressed regret, acknowledging that his assumptions about the situation were incorrect. My mom gave me a look. She must want me to make the final decision regarding this person. Misunderstandings happen, I sighed. Kindly try to remain composed and consider your options the next time. Then Emily's father turned red in the face, murmured, "I'm sorry," and turned to go. Then Dr. Smith asked me whether I truly could forgive him. My parents appeared to be concerned about the same things as her, but I shrugged and said, I had a lot of miscommunications and failures when I was younger. He must adore his kid above everything else, or else he wouldn't have behaved so brazenly, don't you think? You're right, my father responded with a gentle sigh. I won't say anything further if that's how you feel. Do you think that's okay, honey? And went back to the sofa in the main room. With a startled expression, my mother turned to face the physician and asked him what was wrong. I observed my mother ask, "Are you Sarah?" with hesitation. After introducing herself as Sarah, the doctor grinned broadly and said, "It's been a long time, ma'am." My mother's tight face broke into a happy one in an instant. She grinned broadly and struck up a quick chat with the female doctor, Sarah. "Oh my God, Sarah, it's you. When did you return? You've grown really gorgeous. Why didn't you inform us earlier?" I interrupted my talkative mother and asked her to fetch us some tea because she didn't seem to be stopping. I also remembered when I heard the name Sarah. "Are you Sarah Smith, who sat next to me for 3 years in high school?" Subsequently, Sarah, the female physician, gave a nod. Then she made an unexpected statement. "The fact that Emily's father is present is coincidental. I was here for something else. Our old bet is still unresolved. I arrived to complete it." As I wondered what she meant, a memory popped into my mind. It happened soon after we enrolled in high school. That day, Sarah had said something unexpected. "Hey, let's see who can get a perfect score on Mrs. Johnson's test first, and let's compete on all our test scores." Our English teacher, Mrs. Johnson, was notorious for her extremely difficult assignments. Though I can speak English very well, I still found myself uttering quite frequently. Not even Sarah, who spoke English well in casual chats, had scored above 98 points. We were still in competition our senior year, but I started skipping classes because I was going overseas. Since I didn't intend to attend college, I didn't even bother to take the makeup exam, and didn't even study for the final examination of the second term, which I missed due to a cold. That seems to be the reference point she was making. "We might have had a winner in that last test, but you did nothing." "Yeah, so you won by default, Sarah." "What? How am I supposed to be happy with that?" Sarah handed me an answer sheet and a test paper before I could inquire what she meant. I stared at her, confused, and she answered with a self-assured smile. I kept the last test and printed it out from my computer. Sarah gave off the impression of being totally committed. I hesitantly agreed because it was obvious that she wouldn't go unless I accepted the challenge. I thought as I quickly skimmed the test. I used to find these tests challenging, but now I could solve them easily. My father spoke English when I was younger, so that was the only reason I understood it. I had no actual exposure to BR. But having lived abroad for the last 20 years, I felt that this test was at primary school level. However, I ran into trouble with the final question. Sarah chuckled as she noticed my hesitancy and continued, "I got stuck on that one too." I exclaimed, "Aha," and ultimately scored 99 points. Had I done it correctly, I would have received 100. I looked it over and couldn't locate the solution, so I made a guess. I received the same 99 points as Sarah when the test was graded. It's a tie then. The score was never decided after all. I saw her phone vibrating in her pocket while she was saying that. Sarah went after savoring the tea and pastries my mother had made, saying it seemed the hospital was calling. My mom regretted her decision as she saw her leave. I asked, figuring she could know something about Sarah. Sarah apparently enrolled in a prestigious medical school in Japan following her high school graduation. My mother, who often saw a family doctor in a nearby town, was unaware that Sarah had taken over the hospital's management from her father, who had founded it. Sarah took over her father's hospital and is now the director. That astonished me to hear. She had only returned a week ago from the neighbors. I was astounded by how my mother, who has a large social circle, had learned so much in just 1 hour. More than anything, though, Sarah really got to me. Yes, she was a doctor now. It wasn't shocking because she received the best scores, but it got me thinking about how our paths were different. But that question continued to worry me. This explanation doesn't sit well with me, even if it is the proper one. Why did Mrs. Johnson think this was accurate? My mom cocked her head, perplexed. I searched for the truth, but I was unable to discover it. I forced it from my head, realizing that thinking about it any longer would be pointless. The days that followed went by without incident until 2 days before I left to go back overseas. We had a guest in the evening, and as I opened the door, I saw Emily with her infant. I appreciate your assistance the other day. I apologized profusely. My father also created a great deal of trouble, she stated. Her father stood behind her, visibly uncomfortable. It's all right. That doesn't concern me, I answered. Emily looked relieved when I told her that. So did her father. As a thank you, they had brought cakes from a well-known bakery in the area. I took the cakes since I didn't want to be impolite if I didn't accept, and they gave me several bows before they left. My mother cheerfully poured tea and put the cakes on plates after I told her about this. My parents loved sweets. We chose to savor the cakes since they were given to us as an apology. I smiled at the delicious taste that was generated by the tangy strawberries and thick cream. My father, who had a sweet tooth, started talking as soon as he finished his cake. This cake has soul, I can tell. It's very tasty. I realized right then and quickly went upstairs to my room. Why did Kathy cry here? Was the last question I had overlooked, and I read it again. The long passage's final question was simple, and choice 2 should have been the correct response. It was also Sarah's instinctive choice, and she was ultimately mistaken. Although it looked like something that could be predicted, no one had been able to provide the necessary justification for the answer. I made the decision to reread the English text with great care and attention, losing myself in the characters' feelings. Just as I was doing this, I grasped the answer and started to run. I went to Sarah's medical facility. I wasn't sure whether I could see her because she might be preoccupied with deliveries, but luckily, she was taking a break and sipping coffee in the courtyard. Sarah looked at me and widened her eyes. What's not right? Why do you feel the need to rush? I figured out the answer to that question, I said. Surprised, Sarah leaned forward. Not at all. We were given the answer by Mrs. Johnson, but not the explanation. I started off slowly, answering the odd question. The remaining questions could be answered using common sense, and the story itself was commonplace. However, I recalled something. It's evident from reading the text that Kathy was inspired by a well-known individual. This individual had a reputation for declaring, "Life has no answers. Only forward motion exists. After that, solutions arise." Thus, I inferred from the phrases that came before. Why did Kathy cry? Was it her sadness from breaking up with her fiancé? Were the tears brought on by sadness? No. What if this well-known individual served as her model? As if realizing something herself, Sarah whispered, "No way." Then Sarah heard a nurse's call. Sarah had to go out right away since a woman was in labor and was moving quickly. Let's meet at that place and check the answer. Sarah responded, "This time we'll settle the score." And then she ran off with a smile as bright as the sun. I came on the morning of my flight. I was going to head out of town after lunch because the flight was in the evening. Sarah arrived at the prearranged location. She had the morning free and had arranged for another OB/GYN to cover for her. Sarah was holding her phone when I went to see our previous mentor, Mrs. Johnson, and she promised to come back right away if something unexpected happened. But the nameplate on the door in front of me said Kenneth. Since we had been in her care, Sarah and I were both aware of Mrs. Johnson's residence. We were astonished to see the individual who answered the doorbell when we rang it. It was Emily, the previous pregnant woman, who came out, not Mrs. Johnson. After we brought up Mrs. Johnson, Emily, who had been taken aback by our presence, quickly realized and extended an invitation for us to come into the living room. It was discovered that Mrs. Johnson was residing in a care facility due to her dementia. Her granddaughter was Emily. My dad and I are forgotten by Grandma. She hasn't even remembered that she got married and changed her last name. Emily added, I've heard some stuff about you too. I have 2 unforgettable students, Emily added, pulling out a letter while I was wondering what was going on. They had a covered competition to see who could finish my test with a perfect score first. Those are the first words of this letter. Sarah and I held our breath as we realized she was referring to us. Emily read on slowly. There is no solution to this question because it was practically written for the 2 of them. That's the response. I think Richard and Sarah will come here and discover the truth. The letter concludes here. Emily passed the letter to us. There was a pause before Sarah said, Kathy didn't cry because she was sad. She sobbed, first from optimism that she would be able to go on, and then from frustration at herself for not having an answer. The options didn't contain the solution. The solution was to not exist. I had come to the same conclusion, so I nodded. After expressing our gratitude to Emily, we strolled to the station while chatting. How did you realize the trick? With Sarah asking. Although I was initially perplexed as well, my father's use of the term soul helped me to understand. I always thought there was something strange about the words as I read it. The way the story was written made it uncomfortable even for an English language expert, as if it were pointing us in the direction of something. It dawned on me that Mrs. Johnson desired for us to witness the girl's soul. She was modeled after a well-known figure, and I deduced the solution from his well-known quotation. It resembles Mrs. Johnson a lot. She had always been a fan of French writers, and this well-known individual was one as well. Sarah gave a slow nod, then appeared perplexed. By the way, your father always talked about soul and spirit, didn't he? He is a romantic indeed. I suppose I got that from him. Then I understood another ruse. That concludes the matter. Despite having served in the military, my father had many contacts, including French writers. Furthermore, I was aware of his discreet acquaintance with Mrs. Johnson. I recognized Mrs. Johnson's residence because of this link, and my father was the only one who was aware of my other side. It's possible that my father spoke with Mrs. Johnson. Mrs. Johnson made up this question because she was aware of my dreams. No, it makes sense. She was probably more familiar with my heart than I was. It felt at last like the puzzle pieces were coming together for me. As an artist, I am currently touring the globe. I told my father that I wanted to be a soulful musician before I departed for my foreign trip. Mrs. Johnson's acquaintance with my father undoubtedly informed her of this. She wanted to use the test to let me know how he felt. She intended to give me encouragement in 2 ways. Answers come later. The force to move on is all that is needed. Kathy was fashioned after me rather than a well-known individual. I remembered how much Mrs. Johnson, who was usually quiet and mysterious, loved Sarah and me. We had reached the station, but Sarah seemed perplexed as I muttered something to myself. Hey, I'm not sure I get it. By your heart, you indicate that Kathy was fashioned like you. What does it mean? What topic are you discussing? Sarah, I think we'll meet again in 6 months. I replied, laughing. Then I'll explain. I gestured to her vibrating phone in her pocket. Is there an urgent need? I wish you luck. I waved at her as I got on the train, and she quickly returned the call. I saw Sarah 6 months after I made my promised trip back to Japan. I knelt in front of her and held out a tiny box, eager to hear her response. I could never forget you, but I decided to pursue a career as an AR artist. Your face continued to appear in my thoughts even after I left the country. It still does. You had grown so gorgeous that at first I didn't even realize who you were. How can we achieve our dreams together? Do we have to part with one? No. Answers will arrive later. Will you date me with an eye toward marriage, Sarah? Sarah accepted the silver ring, her face contorting into a smile as tears filled her eyes. You mean you managed to fulfill both of your dreams? Picking between being with me and living out your dream. Both. Really? You and Mrs. Johnson are such circle jerks. Indeed. I will. Mrs. Johnson must have known that, like my father, I harbored love feelings for Sarah. She gave me support for the English exam. She wanted to assist her troublesome students, even though she was unable to immediately intervene. Mrs. Johnson was that kind of lady. People in the vicinity cheered and applauded us after my public proposal. After a year of marriage, we spent our last day together at my parents' house before moving into our new house. My mother and I helped my father, who was very inebriated, get to his bedroom. We went into his room, and I was taken aback. These are images of the artist wearing a mask. Every singer combined. Was Dad really that fond of them? With grace, my mother chuckled. Soul music has always appealed to your father. He claims to have a strong spiritual connection to those songs. My father said, I love that vocalist more than anyone in the world, as we were laying him to sleep. He is, after all, my pride and delight. My mother gave me a gentle stroke on the back as I started to cry. After having baby, Sarah returned to work 2 years later, and our days have been hectic ever since. So, are you done with your artist activities? Yes, I am. I didn't know who I was, so I continued hiding my face, but I don't need to anymore. That band needs a singer who is a stranger to the rest of them. Members told me I'm no longer relevant. Well, they all seem to wish you happiness, Sarah said, laughing. It felt as though the new vocalist's debut song was even dedicated to you. I felt that those guys had done something extremely profound when I listened to that music. Then I thought about Emily, the new singer in the masked band I played with before. She's from Japan. Emily was crying as she watched him on screen. The girl Kathy and the issue Mrs. Johnson created. Kathy opted to live a robust life, and, like her fiancé, she said goodbye to him when he went to follow his goals. Emily most likely feels the same way. She raised her child with her family and became a fantastic mother, without disclosing the identity of the father. Everybody has a secret or two. I wish for Emily's and the new singer's happiness. Oh, let's go visit Mrs. Johnson sometime and tell her our news. What a fantastic idea. Even though she may not recall us, we will still be chatting over tea like old friends. We talked about such insignificant topics, and I relished the delight I had at last held in my own hands.